We begin with the song.
Now I'm told that you are really the king of calypso singers, is that right?
Yes,
Want to music for us?
Right now.
Yes.
London is the place for me. London, this lovely city. You can go to France or America, India, Asia or Australia, but you must come back to London City. Well, believe me, I am speaking broad-mindedly. I am glad to know my mother country. I've been traveling the countries years ago, but this is the place I wanted to know, darling London. This is the place for me.
That recording is momentous for several reasons. First, it's a performance on the dock of the Empire Windrush, the ship whose arrival is considered to mark the inauguration of Caribbean migration to Britain. Landing 3 years after the end of World War II, carrying 492 immigrants from the West Indies, the Windrush exists in the British imaginary as a metonym for a new world of tolerance and possibility. The clip is still played on British television today. Second, the performance is a huge moment for the history of Calypso, as the self-styled king of Calypso singers represents Trinidad on a new global stage. Little of the limited scholarship on Kitch overlooks this moment, but none devotes considerable attention to the performance itself. Today, I want to closely examine that performance to illustrate how Lord Kitchener, hereafter Kitch, or on occasion the Grand Master, how Kitch straddles the complicated currents of modernity, performatively engaging this epoch and epistemology shifting era, declaring that the margin has now infiltrated the center and what fun it will be. I intend no conjecture on what Kitch consciously intended, but instead hope to identify in the performance the glimmer of a current which runs between distinct epistemologies and with such jubilance that it might help us better understand modernity's violent, still unresolved tensions. When I speak of contrasting epistemologies, my understanding is shaped by thinkers and writers, Edouard Glissant, Sylvia Wynter, Paul Gilroy, among others, whose work helps us understand that the tension between the imperialist center and the West Indian margin was not merely one of land and power. Instead, it was also about the conflict between a continental Western Enlightenment view of the world as binary, intentional, and directed, and an insular view of the world as archipelagic, of the world as essentially one of multiplicity and heterogeneity. The concept of multiplicity has its material corollary in the West Indies, an actual archipelago. And indeed, Trinidad boasts of society remarkably archipelagic even within its own borders. Here are some details. We can see here that Trinidad has a cultural multiplicity, a Byzantine system of class and racial identities, and a complicated, if not scattered, colonial character. As a quick contrast, let's look at the Western Enlightenment epistemology. Cultural multiplicity becomes binary splits like margin and center. There's a far more binary color line that was ensconced in legal codes, and of course, a rather clear mercantilist colonial understanding, the mother country and everyone else. These are gross simplifications necessitated by my time constraints. But what I want to highlight is that Trinidad offered not just an oppositional perspective, but instead an entirely distinct epistemology, one liminal rather than binary, ambivalent rather than codified, the carnival over the commercial marketplace. And indeed, we see this epistemology best reflected in Trinidad's remarkably complex carnival, and more specifically, its dominant music style, calypso, which mixes European, African, and Creolized cultures. Traditionally, calypso songs are songs of the moment, oral vehicles for the news of the day, or most often, celebrations for that year's carnival meant to then be abandoned. In other words, they're ephemeral songs reflecting the fluidity of social and temporal change. They also carry a subversive quality. Birthed from slave yard songs, calypsos evolved in the streets of Carnival after the emancipation to become a subversive site wherein the underclass could perform their passive resistance without interrupting the party. As I'll discuss later, Calypso was itself at a crossroads at Kitch's time, balancing the demands of modernity and begging its practitioners to respond. Kitch comes of age at a time when Calypso itself was at a crossroads, a site for the clashing of epistemologies, not terribly unlike the man who claimed in 1948 to be its king, or the song he sang to prove it. Now to the performance. I'd like to begin with the setting, the Tilbury Dock. We can only imagine how loaded that stage must have been for its audience in 1948. For both the British and the 492 immigrants, this historic moment might have felt positively ahistorical. After all, for centuries, the sea for the racialized subaltern had flowed in only one direction, westwards toward subjugation. The dock, then, was metonym for what I'll call the reverse Atlantic, one which, in offering passage in the other direction, now promised agency to those previously at the margin. The challenge of the reverse Atlantic to the British might have not just been practical, what do we do with this new population? Are they going to assimilate? What does this mean for taxes? But also ontological. If they are indeed other, does that mean our world has become other? Are we losing ourselves? So before anyone speaks at Tilbury, the setting is charged. What's spoken there promises to be significant. And it is fun to watch the full broadcast. The first three men interviewed all offer their hope for gainful employment. They're so controlled, they're so proper, they're so appropriate. Not to say that it's dull to watch them. On the contrary, it's easy to read in their interviews the depths of their double consciousness as they speak not only to this new reality in Britain, but also for their race, their homelands, their futures. It's like they don't want to stand out. They want to say the right thing and move on. It makes sense, but here comes Kitch, dressed in an indigo blue suit and a wide-brimmed trilby hat on his head, a wry little smile on his face. He is not conformity. It's all flair, particularity. It's the grandmaster. He doesn't want that camera to go anywhere. It's an impressive gambit, given that the general audience likely knew anything about Calypso. But Kitch was accustomed to earning attention, even at 26. Born in rural Arima in 1922 as Aldwin Roberts and orphaned at 14, Kitch never let hardship hinder what he believed himself born to do, sing Calypso. He mastered a rural competition, then moved to Port of Spain, where he became a major figure, building a reputation for crafting dynamic melodies far outside the usual Calypso repertoire of 10 or 12 tunes. He played for Harry Truman in 1945. He co-founded his own Calypso tent, renowned for eclectic influences like Latin horns, and was never shy about admitting his ambition to be bigger than the island of his birth. So when Kitch braved the reverse Atlantic to bring Trinidadian Calypso to the mother country, it must have felt like destiny. I love that moment when the Tilbury reporter asks him if he'll sing, and he shrugs a little. Right now, it's such brazenly false humility. Of course he was going to sing. That's why he was there. But that confidence and flair makes the lyrics a little confounding. On first read, the lyrics seem as though he's not simply accepting subservience to the dominant culture, but is embracing it. It's a will to assimilation almost. Donald Hill describes Calypso lyrics as, quote, a Bible of Creole thought obscured through layers of indirection. But then what do we do with such a straightforward utterance as Kitch's song? Whatever double consciousness he felt, these lyrics really don't let on. The song insists that not only will he be accepted in the colonial empire, but that he belongs there. From where does such optimistic confidence come? Is it naivete, performative self-fulfilling prophecy, preemptive subservience, stroking their egos in hopes it'll pay off? Admittedly, it's difficult not to read the utterance through hindsight, knowing the British would never entirely accept these immigrants as their countrymen. So let's simply look at the lyrics as a text in themselves. Let's identify what they tell us about the relationship between the song's narrator and the empire. The basic sentiment's clear but intense. London is not merely an appropriate or efficacious spot for the narrator. Instead, their synergy is practically fated. London is the place for him. But there's a type of subservience here too. Look at the passive phrasing. London is the place for me. London as the dominant subject, with the subsumed subaltern speaker as the object of the sentence. Contrast that, for instance, with Sinatra's love letter to NYC. I'm gonna take it, New York. Second, I note that the song doesn't mention Trinidad. If you've ever heard Calypso or its descendants like soca, you know one thing that they love to do is to mention Trinidad a lot. But instead, Kitch uses 5 non-London geographical references, 4 of which, India, America, Australia, and Asia, were former British colonies. Of course, Kitch was probably thinking more of scansion than semiotics, but nevertheless, these lyrics embrace an imperial epistemology. Europe remains always at the center. The final point to mention is the song's obvious fictionality. It's fair to presume that most listeners didn't believe this man had been to France, much less Australia. Here we wonder then if Kitch, who would later be called by Calypsonian David Rudder the voice of the Caribbean people, might have been speaking as a sort of everyman. Taken that way, as a West Indian everyman, then the expression gains weight as simultaneously a pragmatic acknowledgement of imperial epistemology and a cocky declaration, subservience but without sacrificing agency, as if to say, we of the Windrush are indeed assimilating to your way of the world, but we are choosing to do that. Taken this way, there is an ambivalence, both an acceptance and a refusal of a colonial reality. Kitch had written the song on the ship 4 days earlier, knowing nothing about London or his future yet. But in its complicated, ambivalent embrace of what was to come, it seems he had a pretty good idea of where he was going. Given that calypsos usually understand as a lyric-centered form, it makes sense I begin there. But the musical elements in his performance remind us perhaps that any lyric-centered discourse is itself a reflection of Enlightenment epistemology, one that favors written fixed denotation over the more amorphous opacity of musical performance. And there's little doubt Kitch saw himself as a musician, not just a singer. He was a superlative composer of instrumental steel band arrangements. He still has the record for the most road march victories. And in London, he built a reputation for being able to play with musicians of all types, engaging Latin, African, and US jazz rhythms without a lick of professional training. And it's clear, Kitch does not merely give us lyrics at Tilbury, he performs a song. Recall how in between each line, he hums that busy overflow of clustered notes, imitating a stand-up bass, and how he never stops moving his shoulders, his hand, his head. He might be alone, but he's rocking a full band performance anyway. In the music, at least, there's no West Indian everyman, only his own charisma. He not only demands, but expects attention, subtly unbalancing the power structure, much as the Windrush unbalanced the imperialist Atlantic currents. Perhaps there is some subversion here, after all. There's one final element of his performance that I think is important to analyze, the mediation via the television camera, which I argue is not just circumstance, but is part of the performance's essential ontology. Kitch was not only playing to the camera, but was also engaging with what Alexander Wiley has called sonic modernity. Sonic modernity carries with it the anxiety of an authentic creation that's separated by technology from its original essence. Does the television, with its commoditized nature, enrich or demean Kitch's performance at Tilbury? Either way, we can't understand the performance without it. At this time, Calypso was grappling with the anxieties of sonic modernity. Ever since the first vocal calypsos were recorded in the 1930s, there was a fear that the island's carnival music was becoming generic popular music. Songs grew shorter to reflect the length of a vinyl side. Time signature shifted to 4/4 from the more polyrhythmic ones. And a new value was placed on the articulation of the English lyrics, especially after Harry Belafonte, Jamaican, not Trinidadian, had a calypso light hit with Deo. But Kitch didn't care about those changes. He embraced them. He went to England to record, and there are great stories from the time of the joy he took in hearing his playback. He had an almost natural instinct for mediated expression, which in epistemological terms means he was interested in the fixed commodity, arguably at the expense of that looser, ephemeral, in the moment quality from which calypso grew. So Kitch welcomed sonic modernity at Tilbury. But does that mean he's trading one epistemology for another? I don't think so. Instead, I consider Kitch's embrace of mediation at Tilbury as rather an expression of his archipelagic mentality, one which could include the continental imperialist modern epistemology as part of itself without necessarily privileging that. In other words, in the same way that his song could both performatively defer to the audience's sense of superiority without sacrificing his esoteric Trinidadian style, Kitch at Tilbury exploited modernity as a tool, one island in his archipelago of aesthetic and affective talents. The irony, of course, is that the imperial mindset is born on binary. There is no middle ground. But Kitch's performance shows no interest in such limitations. He wants to control modernity, not give in to it. Looking at Kitch's command of the mediation this way, we might say he never actually embraced London as a center, but instead adeptly shifted his own center time and time again. Perhaps London is the place for him, not because it's where he belongs or because it's an epistemology he wants to embrace, but simply that London, as an articulation of the optimism of post-war modernity now open to those previously excluded, is the next tool he plans to master before he eventually conquers the world. So in my analysis, Kitchener's performance was an expression of his desire to have it all. The radical subjectivity, the Enlightenment, as well as the communal archipelagic diffusion of the islands, the articulation and the vivacious inarticulable, the imperial ground and the ever-moving ocean, London, England, and Arima, Trinidad. In some ways, he rode those currents the rest of his life. He spent 14 years in England, recording over 500 calypsos, and when he returned to Trinidad in '62, he was a superstar, until he died in 2000. 18 years later, the British government grew criticism for threatening to deport the citizens who came on the Windrush for racist charges that they lacked papers that weren't available at the time. It's a tragic response to what Kitch said in '48 about London, and a reminder that the vestiges of colonialism are far from dead. But perhaps in this performance and in its multiplicities, we might have a chance to hope that through willful, optimistic errantry like Kitchener's, perhaps we might yet find our way forward. Thanks very much.